Welcome. Let's begin. The Silent Archive has initiated an audit of your presence. Over the next few minutes, we're going to analyze the very architecture of your reality. Don't worry, there are no right or wrong answers here, only a diagnosis.
Our audit starts with this, a pretty blunt premise. Matter is a lie. Now, that's a stark statement, right? It's designed to get past your defenses. Because according to the source material, this single idea is the root of a massive, pervasive sensory deception.
And get this isn't just some abstract philosophy, this is hard physics. This number here illustrates the clinical reality behind that statement. If you could somehow remove all the empty space from the atoms of every single human being on this planet, our entire combined mass would fit inside a single sugar cube. You are, quantitatively, almost entirely nothingness. So this brings us to the first phase of our audit, diagnosing the illusion of substance. This is all about identifying the fundamental error in how what's called the unrefined mind perceives existence. And here are the primary symptoms of that error: a pathological obsession with substance. It's the belief that the 0.1%, the stuff you can touch, the possessions you own, the social validation, the noise of your achievements, is what constitutes your being. You're taught to worship the shell, while the core, that massive 99.9%, is just leaking out into the void. And here's the inevitable consequence. When your entire sense of self is propped up by that fragile 0.1%, your world is literally built on a foundation of ghosts. The source calls this a cold, acidic realization. The more you desperately try to hold on, the faster it all just slips right through the molecular gaps of your existence. So, the whole thing hinges on this crucial shift in perspective. The unrefined mind is terrified of the void. It sees it as an end, as a failure. But the architect, the subject of our audit, sees that very same void as the canvas, as infinite potential from which everything can arise. You see, you're not a creature of matter. You are a frequency of intent. This understanding builds into a kind of governing law. So this next section introduces what the source calls the poetic science that allows you to not just understand the void, but to actually master it. The key concept here is absolute presence. You know, in physics, the vacuum is never truly empty. It's this boiling sea of potential. Well, your presence is like that. It's the ability to occupy the silence, the gap between the signals, with real focus and intensity. True power, sovereignty, isn't found in all the motion. It's found in the stillness. The Silent Archive actually quantifies this state with a governing formula, the presence constant. Now, don't get hung up on the complex math. I want you to see this as a conceptual model, like a map of the forces that are constantly at play inside your own consciousness. So let's decode this map. The top part, the numerator, that's what builds your presence, your intensity of focus, and the stability of your internal quiet. That's your canvas. The bottom part, the denominator, that's what the source calls the predator. These are the forces that dilute your presence, your attachment to physical things, and the constant high-entropy noise of the environment. And this illustrates the outcome just brilliantly. When your internal focus overpowers all that external noise and attachment, something profound happens. You stop being a resident in reality, and you start becoming the fabric of reality. Your presence is felt, not because people see you, but because the void itself begins to resonate with your frequency. But what happens if you fail this audit? Well, that brings us to the shadow self, the state known as dissipation. This is the consequence of letting those predator variables win the fight. And this is what dissipation feels like, the sensation of being a gas in a vacuum with no container. You just spread thinner and thinner, your signal getting weaker and weaker, completely lost in the noise. It's the result of fearing that internal void and constantly trying to fill it with anything from the outside. And you know, the external systems around us are basically designed to encourage this state. They thrive on your fear of the gap. They feed you a constant stream of high-entropy noise, shallow validation, temporary pleasures, just to make sure you never have to face the silence of your own internal architecture. You just become a hollow shell. So the crucial point is this. The void itself is not the enemy. It's neutral. It's the canvas. The real executioner of your presence is all the noise you frantically use to fill that void. Okay, so we've diagnosed the problem and we've examined its shadow. Now let's move on to the solution, the architect's protocol.
The protocol has 3 pretty distinct steps. First, variable liquidation. You have to conduct an internal audit and then liquidate, get rid of, all non-essential attachments to substance. You have to create the void. Second, stillness saturation. This is about practice. You focus on the silence that comes before and after every signal until the silence itself feels heavier than the sound. And finally, the 0-point decree. A fundamental shift to start operating from the perspective that you are the space, not just some object within it.
The ultimate transformation that's described in the source is, well, it's profound. Through this protocol, it says one transcends their physical form. You're no longer just a person, you become a fundamental principle, a geometric law operating in the universe.
And this just perfectly encapsulates that final state of mastery. You aren't the noise, you aren't the chaos, you aren't the scream. You are the underlying silence, the fundamental constant that the scream emerges from and that it returns to. You are the governor.
And so the audit concludes by turning right back to you. The diagnosis has been presented. The protocol has been outlined. The only remaining variable now is your action. The question is, what non-essential substance will you choose to liquidate first?
All right, let's get right into it. Today we're plugging into something a little different. This is a direct transmission from a source that calls itself the Silent Archive. And it's not here to give us information, it's here to run an audit. An audit of your presence. Let's see what their diagnostic says.
So right out of the gate, we get this core paradox. This one statement is really the key to the whole thing. It's meant to challenge everything you think you know about what it means to exist. Just kind of let that one sink in as we go.
Okay, let's dive into the diagnosis. According to the archive, the #1 failure of, well, what they call the unrefined mind is its complete obsession with substance. You know, this deeply ingrained and deeply wrong belief that the only thing that's real is what's tangible, that what you can touch is what you are.
And to be blunt about it, matter, the way you experience it, is basically a sensory lie, a deception. We spend our whole lives building up this physical shell while the real core of us is just leaking out into the void. And this isn't some kind of philosophical thought experiment. They're framing this as a hard physical reality.
Get this. That number, 99.9%. That's how much of you is just empty space. I mean, it's wild to think about. If you took all the empty space out of every single human on the planet, the entire mass of humanity would fit inside one sugar cube.
And this fact right here reveals 2 fundamentally different paths you can take. The unrefined mind, it worships that tiny, fleeting 0.1% of stuff and sees all that emptiness, the void. It's just nothingness, an end. But the architect sees it completely differently. That emptiness is the canvas. It's the raw material for creation, a kind of geometry of nothingness, just waiting for you to impose your will on it.
So, you gotta ask yourself, can you feel it now? That kind of cold, prickly feeling when you realize that the more you try to grab onto the physical world, the faster it just slips away through the gaps. This is the first step of their audit, just recognizing that fragility.
So, what happens to those who are afraid of the void? Well, the prognosis isn't great. It leads to a state the archive calls dissipation. Think of it as the shadow that chases anyone who's obsessed with substance.
This right here is the core feeling they're talking about. Imagine being a gas in a vacuum with no walls. You're just spreading thinner and thinner. Your signal, your essence, just gets diluted by this massive, overwhelming noise that you have absolutely no control over. This is the fate of anyone who runs away from their own inner emptiness.
And, the system, the Leviathan as they call it, it feeds on this fear. It loves that you're afraid of the silence. So it just pumps out this endless stream of high-entropy content. Temporary pleasures, cheap validation, anything to keep you distracted to make sure you never, ever have to face the silence of your own mind.
And the timeline for this is tragically predictable. Right now, you fill that inner gap with noise from the outside. In doing that, you're actually getting rid of your own internal pressure. And by the time you hit, say, age 45, you wake up and realize you're just a hollow shell, a transparent host for a simulation that doesn't even need you anymore.
So you see, we've had it all wrong. The void, the emptiness, that was never the enemy. It's the noise. The constant chatter we desperately use to fill it. That's the executioner of the self.
But there is a way out. There's a governing law that offers a path back to, well, sovereignty.
And that's what we have to understand next, the law of absolute presence.
First things first, we have to totally correct how we see the void. Even in physics, a vacuum isn't really empty. It's this boiling sea of potential energy, just vibrating with possibility. Your internal void is exactly the same. Real power is found in the stillness, not in all the frantic motion.
And we can actually quantify this state. It's called the presence constant, represented by lambda 0. Now, this isn't just some cool-looking symbol. It's the actual formula that governs your state of being.
Think of this constant as a balance of forces. The top part of the equation, the numerator, that's your power, how strong your internal focus is, and how stable you can keep your mind. The bottom part, the denominator, that's the predator, your attachment to physical stuff and all the distracting noise from the environment.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. When your lambda 0 value hits a critical point, the change is total. You stop being a thing in a space. You actually become the space. Your intention itself starts to have a kind of localized gravity, and it doesn't even need a physical body anymore.
So the big question is, how do you get there? Well, the prescription is actually a very specific method. Let's break down what the archive calls the architect's protocol for shifting from substance to pure geometry.
It's a three-step process. First up, variable liquidation. You have to audit your own mind. Find every single substance you're clinging to for a false sense of security, and just liquidate it. You have to actively create the void. Second is stillness saturation. This means focusing on the silence, the gap before and after every thought, every sound, until that silence feels heavier and more real than the sound itself. And finally, step 3 is the 0-point decree. You start to operate from the belief that you are the void already. You're the space in which everything else is happening.
And the result of this decree is basically invulnerability. I mean, think about it. If you are the space where things happen, how can anything move you? If you're the canvas itself, how can you be deluded? It's a state of pure, absolute stability.
So, in the end, it really comes down to these two final states. You've got the dissipated node, whose presence level ends up near 0, they're nothing more than a crack in the wall. Or you have the architect, who achieves absolute presence and literally becomes a fundamental law of their own reality.
And this is the endgame for the architect. By midlife, the attachment to a physical body is just gone. It's discarded. You're not a person anymore. You are a geometric law, and you operate with the cold, perfect precision of a ghost. This is the potential. You stop being the chaotic scream of noise, and you become the silent, governing void where that scream is born, and where it ultimately has to die.
The audit is complete. Stay silent. Stay wise. The archive is the void.